¿Cómo están? Muy buenas tardes. Gracias por acompañarnos en una emisión más del Seminario CIGA Alexander von Humboldt. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a quienes nos acompañan a través del canal de YouTube del CIGA y de la cuenta de Facebook también del CIGA. Estamos inaugurando en el tono y en el tenor del regreso a las actividades presenciales una emisión del seminario que tiene un carácter híbrido. A partir de esta fecha vamos a tratar de realizar más seminarios que tengan este carácter de presencial, sin dejar desde luego de transmitir en vivo a través de nuestros canales para quienes nos acompañen desde otras partes de la República o incluso al extranjero y que, bueno, han tenido el interés en acompañarnos en estas emisiones. El día de hoy queremos saludar y agradecer al doctor Brent Ward, quien nos acompaña el día de hoy, y al doctor Manuel Mendoza, investigador de nuestro centro, quien hizo la gestión necesaria para poder tener la conferencia del día de hoy. Dejamos el uso de la palabra al doctor Manuel Mendoza para que justo nos presente al doctor Ward. Adelante, doctor Mendoza.
Buenas tardes a todos. Pues es muy grato recibir al doctor Ward. Él es geólogo cuaternarista y hace geología aplicada también. Tiene una amplia experiencia en estudios de geomorfología, sedimentología, estratigrafía y geocronología, temas en los que yo también estoy involucrado. Y sus teorías de investigación se centran en la geología glacial más tradicional y los peligros naturales, temas altamente relevantes para las condiciones en las que nos encontramos. Su investigación tiene que ver con reconstrucciones paleoambientales asociadas a periodos glaciales y no glaciales, y la mayor parte de su trabajo se encuentra en la cordillera canadiense, pero sus alumnos han trabajado en todo el norte de Canadá, sobre todo en el Yukon. Y tiene una variedad de proyectos financiados por agencias gubernamentales. Entre los métodos que utiliza para datar se encuentra el radiocarbono, los radionucleidos, usa dendrocronología, luminiscencia óptica estimulada, y también ha trabajado mucho en la cordillera de los Andes. De hecho, mañana nos va a dar una plática a los alumnos de la licenciatura sobre los deslizamientos que ocurren en aquellos lugares. La mayoría de los estudios sobre deslizamientos se relacionan con la presencia de fallas en los sedimentos superficiales, comúnmente relacionados con la actividad forestal. Ayer me platicaba él que durante varios años trabajó en el servicio, en el Ministerio de Bosques de Canadá, haciendo mapas de susceptibilidad a la remoción en masa en aquellos lugares donde se hace actividad forestal para tener las adecuaciones necesarias a los sitios. Y es importante mencionar que además de ser investigador de tiempo, profesor de tiempo completo en el Departamento de Ciencias de la Tierra de la Universidad de San Fraser, es el codirector del Centro de Investigación sobre Peligros Naturales, que se encuentra también asentado en esa misma universidad. Entonces, no le quito más el tiempo, le doy la palabra a él. I would like you to start to speak.
Okay.
I don't want to stall more time.
No, that was too long. All right, well, thank you very much for inviting me. As Manuel said, part of my research is dealing with natural hazards, and we had a very large event last November, and I'm going to be telling you about it today. I apologize for not speaking Spanish. I will try to speak slowly and clearly because I know what it's like to try to listen in a foreign language. And so today I will be talking about the effects of the November 2021 Atmosferic River on southwestern BC. Next, please. So just a brief summary, and this was part of the abstract. We had a very large atmospheric river that affected southwestern BC, and it had major impacts on both people, housing, and infrastructure. It killed at least 6 people and basically cut off southwestern British Columbia, that has about 3 million people there, from the rest of Canada. When you'll see in the talk that what preceded this event also served to make the event worse. And that was, we had a very, very wet fall, so soil moisture was high. And the summer, we had a very bad fire season, which burned large areas that were subsequently impacted. It's estimated that the costs of this disaster are going to be $7.5 billion US in terms of damage from landslides, floods, and stream avulsions and bank cutting. Next slide, please. So we had many examples of landslides affecting roads and railroads. And so this is highway number 1, and this is a large debris flow that affected it. This is one of the railroads that follows the Fraser River that affected the railroad and went all the way down to the river. Oh yeah, that's great, thank you. Next, please. The streams kind of crossed a threshold and migrated laterally and affecting many roads in the area. And this is along the main road that goes through BC for trade, and that's the Coquihalla. Next, please. And there was many communities that were flooded. And this is an example from the community of Merritt, and the entire town was evacuated for at least 3 weeks. Next, please. So before I get into the talk, I'd just like to thank my ex-grad student, Carrie Ann Lau. She works for an environmental consulting company in British Columbia, and she is very involved in hazards such as we saw during this event. And she is an amazing source of knowledge to me. It's always makes me feel very proud when my students go out and actually learn more than me and start helping teach me about some of the different hazards. And so she's instrumental. I actually got images. She'd given a couple presentations. And so she provided stuff for me for this presentation as well. And so she works in areas for different clients. It could be pipelines, it could be roads. And when this event happened, she was right on the forefront of the emergency response, trying to see, whether or not roads and pipelines could be opened up. And so, like I say here, many of the images and probably a lot of the ideas are from her. Next, please. And I also want to have a shout out to Sergio Sepulveda. He is a relatively recent colleague in your sciences department. He's an engineering geologist. And so on the 19th, we did an overflight of many of the areas that were affected. So some of the pictures you see today are from that flight. And we just had a short paper accepted in the Canadian Geotechnical Journal on this event. Next slide. So in terms of an outline, we're kind of in the introduction part, but I'm going to start with background information on the geomorphology of British Columbia, because that had a significant effect on the disaster. I will talk in general about atmospheric rivers, because maybe not everyone knows what they are. And then we'll go into what happened in the November event. And I'll take you through sort of the events that happened almost in real time. At the time, it was very complicated what was going on. And then we'll talk about the consequences of this event. And it's not just, there's a lot of significant consequences here. And what you see here is a bedrock slide I'll talk about later that blocked Highway 7, and it trapped 300 people in the behind that event. Next. So in terms of the geomorphology, in British Columbia, we are a victim of the geologic history of the area. It's a very complex geology. There is accretion of material. There's a lot of tectonics associated with the building of the mountains. And what that does is that there's a very strong kind of east-west grain, I would say, to the orientation of the valleys. And what that means is that there's not many routes that cut across this mountain range. And so the ones that are there have a lot of infrastructure. So all the infrastructure is constrained into these valleys. So there's only a few valleys, and that's where all the roads and the railroads and the pipelines and the power lines and all the telecommunication, all the fiber optic cables are constrained in just a few sites. So now I'm going to show you a detail of the infrastructure in the area affected in southwestern BC. Yep. Okay, so here's a detail. And so in orange are the highways. The railroads are kind of in this sort of yellow color. And then there's some oil and gas pipelines in the black. And so, I'm from the Vancouver area. Simon Fraser University is here. Emmanuel has been there, and so is Violetta. And then in terms of highways, highway number 1 goes to the south of the Fraser River. So this is the biggest river in British Columbia, the Fraser River. It goes to the south and it goes up the Fraser Canyon and then across BC, and this connects us with the rest of Canada. The most important road, however, is highway number 5, and that is what's called the Coquihalla, and that is the main transportation route for goods. And it has probably about 20,000 vehicles on average a day, and almost all the big trucks that take material to and from the port of Vancouver go through the Coquihalla Highway. Highway number 3 is an older route that kind of winds, it's not that great, it winds through the mountains and it travels along the southern part of the highway. And then there's a route, Highway 99, that goes up to Squamish and Whistler. You may have heard about Whistler, it's a very famous ski area, and then goes up across the Fraser and then connects to Highway number 1. And just to mention again that about 3 million people live in this area of southwestern BC. Next, please. So back to the infrastructure, this is an area, actually, can I go back one? I forgot to say one thing. And so I highlighted this area because you can see that this is kind of the nexus or the connection of all these routes in this upper part of what we call the Fraser lowland. And the town of Hope is right here. It's made famous by the first Rambo movie. So if you go there, there's lots of Rambo stuff in Hope. Next, please. And so this is debris flow that occurred out near Hope that affected both lanes of Trans-Canada Highway. It affected the railroad that is on this side of the highway. It went underneath one of the main power lines in the area. There is the Trans Mountain pipeline that goes through here, and they're actually in the process of making it bigger. And then there's also optical lines in this area. So again, you see when we get a landslide here, it can affect many things at the same time. Next. So let's talk a little bit about atmospheric rivers. I don't know if everyone's totally familiar with them, but these are kind of long, kind of narrow, relatively shallow filaments or tracts of concentrated water vapor in the atmosphere. A significant atmospheric river can transport as much as 10 or 15 times the amount of water that's in the Mississippi River. Okay, so these are capable of bringing large quantities of water. So these affect Mexico as well. It's important because most of the rain and snow that occurs in Western North America comes from these. And so this is what replenishes our rivers and streams and our water reservoirs, right? But too much of a good thing can be bad. And when we get a very large atmospheric river, we quite often get some kind of consequence. In this case, you know, a flood or different landslides. And so this is from NOAA, and it's showing how we get lots of precipitation into California. And this is what is usually responsible for the large debris flows that affect California. I think I got everything. Next, please. So this is what they look like. And so for British Columbia, atmospheric rivers generally originate in warm, tropical Pacific waters. And usually they originate around Hawaii. And so the common term for these in British Columbia is Pineapple Express because they're coming from Hawaii. The fact that they are warm as well is important for the consequences, because the warm air means that much of the precipitation falling in the mountains falls as rain rather than snow. And so that precipitation gets into the creeks. The other thing it does is it can add on to the amount of water because it melts the snow that is already there. So we get a rain, what we call a rain on snow event. And what we're finding is that the frequency and the intensity of these atmospheric rivers is increasing, and likely because of anthropogenic climate change. And so this is just, again, an Americano-centric view of atmospheric rivers. So this is what was happening last winter, I believe, and just all the atmospheric rivers that were affecting Western United States. And you can see this is really important with California being in a drought. This is what can I guess, end the drought. But you can see that the Pacific Northwest was the locus of many of these. And so we had, I think, 2 atmospheric rivers before the big event, and then there was 3 more atmospheric rivers that occurred after. And so that was a problem with some of the flooding that had happened because it slowed down the draining of the floodwaters. So these things have happened in the past. This is a significant atmospheric river that occurred in 2003. It tracked a little bit north of Vancouver area, and it hit Pemberton. It was, you can see here the comparison in terms of the total precipitation. The November 2021 event was a little bit bigger, but the Pemberton one was large as well. And it caused significant flooding, it caused landslides, it cut roads and railroads, but it wasn't as big consequence because less people live there and less infrastructure goes through that area. Next. And this is just to remind you where Pemberton is. It's on that Highway 99 that goes up through Whistler. Thanks. So now we'll talk about this large event that occurred in November. This is just some pictures of some of the landslides that happened. So for nerdy people like me that are interested in natural hazards, there was a build-up to this event because we knew it was coming. We knew that things were very wet. And the atmospheric river that had happened just a couple days before, we were concerned about it, but it had impacted northern Washington state more than it had impacted us. But the November 14th event, which technically was from the 13th to the 15th, that was a direct hit on us. And so when the forecast came out and showed the amount of precipitation that was occurring, and the fact that it was not going further to the north and affecting Pemberton, but it was actually curving over and going right into that area where all the infrastructure is, it had us very concerned. And so certainly Carrie Ann and I were texting and calling back and forth because of, you know, what was happening, and I was getting a lot of media requests. And of course, I didn't know that much, so Karen was giving me information, and then she wasn't allowed to give it out as much, and so then I was giving out select things that I was allowed to say to some of the media. But you can see that the prediction was in excess of 250 millimeters of rain, and some areas exceeded that. And generally, this forecast was correct. And the thing that was different about this atmospheric river is that warm, moist air went over the mountains and affected areas in the interior. And that it was a significant factor I'll talk about in terms of flooding in some of those interior communities. And so this is just another picture of what it looked like. Here's all this warm, moist air coming from Hawaii, and then affecting the lower mainland. What it resulted in is intense precipitation for, a day, at least 2 days. Rainfall periods throughout the region ranged anywhere from a 50-year event to an event greater than 1,000 years. So this was a very large event, and it is now been proven that the increased intensity and duration of this can be attributable to climate change. And there's a really excellent paper recently published on this. And this is just showing some of the flood return periods. You can see that here in the interior, where I was mentioning where that warm water was going, it was greater than a 1 in 100 year event. And as I've already mentioned, it caused flooding, bank erosion, landslides, etc. So on November 14th, it began. And so Twitter is something that is quite useful for science. And all us landslide nerds follow Drive BC because that's usually the first evidence that we have that there's a problem. There's some kind of a blockage. And so I can see around noon on November 14th, highway number 5, the big, most important one, was blocked by a landslide. So, okay, so so this was supposed to be kind of sequential, but there was a blockage of Highway 5. I should also mention that this was sort of a long weekend. Our Remembrance Day, where we remember the soldiers in the wars, is November 11th, and that was a Thursday. So a lot of people had taken the Friday off and were away. So there was lots of people away from the lower mainland, and people from the interior in the lower mainland, and people needed to get home. And so we had a blockage of Highway 5. Soon after, that smaller highway, number 3, was blocked. Soon after that, highway number 1 was blocked in Fraser Canyon, which isn't totally unusual. And so, as those things happened, people started moving to different highways. So there was people who went from Merritt and tried to go down the canyon, and then this was blocked. There was people, on the road in this area, and then they were stuck, and then they sort of came back. And then we had a debris flow out near Hope. Well, actually, it's not quite near Hope, which blocked highway number 1. So then there was only highway number 7. And so there was a lot of traffic on highway number 7. And then we had this very large, actually in this case, it was a bedrock failure, which is unusual. Most of the failures are in sediments. And it hit this gully, translated into a debris flow and blocked the highway. And there was another debris flow that happened at almost the same time, a couple of kilometers down the road. And so there was about 300 people trapped in their cars for 2 days. And luckily, and I don't know why no one was killed here, because there was so much traffic here, but there was lots of cars knocked off. There was one serious injury in a van, a boy in a van, who had to be evacuated out by search and rescue. But we had to bring in military helicopters to actually get people out. Next, please. So at this point, the only route in and out of the lower mainland was this Highway 99. And the highway up to Pemberton is pretty good. The highway after that is not great. And so all of a sudden, people are desperate. And so they are traveling back and forth on this highway. Next. And then another debris flow happened. And so this was on the 15th. Probably what made things worse is that there was a small debris flow first that blocked the traffic in both directions. And then literally minutes later, this large event came down and knocked cars. People had gone out of their cars. It was bad. So at least 5 people were killed. I don't know if they've found one of the people yet. It took a couple of weeks to find 3 of the people because they weren't in their car, right? So, and no, it's good. Yeah, please. And so here's some of the cars that were impacted. Cars were knocked over and into the river. And this is Pemberton Search and Rescue trying to find people. So these guys, you can see they're sinking into the mud. These guys are risking their lives to try to find people. And this landslide actually came off an old logging road. So I don't know what the ramifications of that's going to be, because that road should have been what we call deactivated. Next, please. So at this point, on November 15th, we're completely cut off. And so all the railroads are blocked, all the roads are blocked, and we are all stuck here in the lower mainland. And you'll see people starting to panic. Next. So at the same time, there's also flooding occurring. So this is, can you go back one? The animations aren't engaging here. So we're going to talk about the community of Princeton next. And so this is a very small community on this kind of picturesque Highway 3. These cabins should never have been there. I was actually there the summer before, as we were driving through, and said, wow, I would never live here because it's on the floodplain. And of course, the rivers went up very quickly because of the rain melting the snow, and significantly affected. Now we're going to move up to Merritt. And so this was probably the second most significant failure. This earth flood. This was an area where, again, significant snow melt occurred as well as the rain. And so this is a view of Merritt at the time. It came on very, very quickly. The night of November 15th, 14th, they were trying to evacuate people because they couldn't believe how fast the river was going up. So they had an initial evacuation. The Coldwater River actually broke through its banks and started a new channel. I guess, you see how it curves here? It actually went through here. Next. And so this is the new channel of the river, and this car is floating down the river. They ended up evacuating on the 15th the entire population of Merritt, which was over 7,000 people. Most of those people were able to return after 3 weeks. The areas that were strongly affected like this, obviously not, but the whole community was evacuated because of infrastructure damage. The wastewater plant and the water plant were inoperable, and so people could not live in the town until that was fixed. There was, did I mention there was 36 swiftwater rescues because it happened very suddenly at night and a lot of people couldn't get out in time. So again, search and rescue was out, getting people out of their houses. So, and then the one that I guess got the most media attention was Sumas Prairie, which is in the Fraser lowland, just south of Highway number 1. And so there's an interesting history here. So there used to be a lake there called Seminario, which is part of the Sostolo Nation's land. And so this was a very important aquatic environment for both them as well as like waterfowl. Very important on a migration route, lots of things there. But the Dutch settlers wanted the land, and so they drained it and didn't ask the First Nations permission. This was obviously in the 1920s. This was also a bit of a natural flood basin where waters could go and keep the main channels down, right? So anyway, it was turned into farmland. And so this is just a picture of what is LiDAR of the elevation. And you can see there's where the former Sumas Lake used to be. This is the Sumas River, which is a very small river that then goes into the Fraser River. There's something called the Barrowtown Pump Station that is here that takes water out of this lowland of this Sumas Canal, draining it and pumps it into the Sumas River that then goes into the Fraser. The problem is that there's a river called the Nooksack. This is the border with America over here. And when the Nooksack floods, all that water drains down and it goes into Sumas Lake. And so, in fact, I think it's us that want a border wall because we need to keep the water out. So now there's in negotiations between us and the states to actually build better flood protection so that we are not flooded. We'll probably have to help pay for that to save our farmland. So next. And so these are some pictures I took on the overflight. This is the Trans-Canada Highway. Obviously, it can't be used right now, and so it's cutting off communities along the Fraser lowland. It resulted in the evacuation of over 1,000 homes and a huge impact on the agriculture. Because this is such an important area, a lot of poultry farms, a lot of pig farms, a lot of cattle, over 600,000 animals died. So cattle, pigs, and chicken. And this is also an important area for blueberries and other berry crops, and those were significantly affected by the sediment that was deposited by the flood. Next. And so this is just a view of the sun setting as we're flying back to Vancouver, and you can see the effects of this on the community. But really, as I alluded to at the beginning, to understand this better, we need to know what happened before. It was a very wet fall, even before. And so what this shows is the cumulative precipitation that occurred. You can see that it was already quite wet, well above average from the data from 1980. And it compared quite well with that Atmosferic River in 1990. And this is what the antecedent precipitation index, so this is a measure of how much water is already in the ground. You can see September was also wet, and then things continued to be wet, and then we had the Atmosferic River. And so that just means that there's no room for that water to be stored. The other thing that happened is we had an unprecedented heat dome in July. It was the warmest weather that ever affected southwestern BC. The town of Lytton broke the all-time Canadian record 3 days in a row, with the highest temperature being almost 50 degrees Celsius. And literally the next day, a forest fire started and the entire town of Lytton burned. This was followed by significant drought and other warm periods not as warm as the heat dome. It resulted in the third worst fire season, which resulted in huge amounts of evacuations. We spent a lot of money trying to fight fires, and these villages burned down. Now, the problem with forest fires is they make the soils what we call hydrophobic. And so the moisture cannot get in. And so when we have a big event, we don't get any storage. We get runoff from those soils. And so there was lots of areas that had burned that had very serious consequences. And so probably the most significant was what we call Tank Hill this is the Trans-Canada Highway. This is a railroad. The drainage up in behind was burned very extensively. And you can see it took out the highway and the railroad. And this took months to fix, months. And then there was lots of other areas where smaller debris flows occurred in areas that had burned. And so, Carrie Ann and her group, identified areas where there was a direct connection. So we talked about Nikomen River and Lytton Creek. There's some possibility that the Jackass Mountain fire might have affected highway number 1. There's the possibility, not totally sure, that this Juliet Creek fire along the Coquihalla may have triggered more debris flows, but certainly once we get away from the fire areas down here in the Fraser Valley, there's no linkage. So forest fires did exacerbate things in specific areas. So in terms of consequences of this event, I really like landslides, and they're kind of cool. But what was way more significant was the way the rivers responded to the floods, and also the engineering design of the roads. And so this hazard where the bridges were not big enough and the streams wanted to migrate laterally was the biggest event. And what that triggered was severe restriction in terms of movements of goods and people, right? And it was cut off, and then it was very restricted after. So here's just some examples. The Coquihalla Highway was built in the 80s. It was supposed to be state-of-the-art. I question that, but it definitely needs to be rebuilt to a higher standard, because this, it should not have happened. And so engineers need to talk more with fluvial geomorphologists and geomorphologists to better understand how the landscape can change during one of these big events. And so I'm also going to talk, what I've talked about yet is this smaller highway that goes from there, where the serious flood was, and connects with highway number 1. And this did not get as much attention. This was an area, because it's a smaller rural communities, a lot of First Nations, didn't get as much attention in the media. They have now reopened most of this road, but a lot of Highway 8 was gone. You can see here it is here, and it's basically gone. There's a bridge connecting the community on this side, and it's gone. One person was killed here when their house was swept away. And here's another example of there's not much of that highway left. And so, again, this is downstream of Merritt. So all that water from the cold water and the Nikomen came together, and it just seems like it crossed a threshold, and it went really broad, and it just eroded that very narrow valley. So, right, and I'm going to talk a little bit about oil and gas pipelines down here, where they all come together. And so this is a picture we took on the overflight, and this is the Coquihalla Highway. This is that big one. You can see it's twin. There's two separate lanes. We've lost all of one of the lanes. In fact, this still isn't fixed. When you go through this section, both ways of traffic have to go on this one. You can see here's a gas pipeline. So this is natural gas pipeline. And so that caused effects. Here's another pipeline, this time affected by a debris flow in the Fraser Canyon. So what did that mean in terms of consequences? Even though the pipeline was not ruptured, they were worried about it, and so they had to shut it down for several days before they allowed more gas for cars to flow through. So that resulted in the implementation of rationing of gas at gas stations. The shipments of materials through the Port of Vancouver in both directions were severely impacted, right? And this had a major effect on not just our economy, but the economy of the Pacific region, because a lot of fertilizer was stopped from going out. A lot of ships actually left empty because they couldn't wait for the transport by the railroad and trucks to get the material out. And of course, the public panicked because they realized they were cut off. And so it probably wouldn't have been as bad, but everybody went to the store and bought a whole bunch of stuff. So there was shortages in the area, and as well as the Okanagan. The areas that really had shortages for real were the communities that were completely cut off. We still had access to the states where we were and in the Okanagan. So in conclusion, this is Canada's, so far, costliest natural hazard. We found that bank erosion was the most significant hazard in the area because it took so much longer to fix the roads. With landslides, they're more localized. Sometimes they don't scour. They seem to be easier to fix. We saw that conditioning by wildfires, the amount of soil moisture from the wet fall, exacerbated or made worse the disaster. In terms of geohazard management, this was a really important lesson for engineers to learn, because the way they designed things in the past maybe doesn't adequately predict how the climate is changing. And, you know, a lot of our infrastructure was built for a climate that no longer exists. And so I'm hoping that when they rebuild these highways, that they actually take the time to improve the design, because many times they just rebuild it the exact same way. The flood frequency analysis, again, because of climate change, it doesn't work anymore. So if you look in the past, when the climate was different and what it is now, and so reevaluation is that the Colorado River, it was thought to be a 200-year event. It probably was only a 1 in 50-year event because of the way the climate is changing. And so what that means, we need to build back better. We need to improve our infrastructure. And we're going to see that climate change will make these atmospheric rivers more frequent and more intense. And as we saw, I mean, it wasn't quite Walking Dead events in the Fraser lowland, but people were fighting over things in grocery stores. And but it certainly affects our resiliency. Anyway, so thank you very much for your attention. And are there any questions?
Les recordamos a quienes nos están siguiendo a través de las redes sociales que pueden dejar sus preguntas y comentarios en el panel, tanto de Facebook como de YouTube, y vamos a dar oportunidad también de atender esas interrogantes desde nuestra parte virtual. ¿Alguna pregunta aquí en sala para el doctor Ward?
Yes.
Solo un favor, ¿podrías hablar fuerte para que te escuchen acá y en el streaming?
There is some regulation for the infrastructure. And how is the law in that?
Yeah, great question. There are what we call building standards that do put sort of minimum standards to the construction. But the way it generally works is that the engineers will design it, and then there'll be another engineering company will review it, and then that's what the government will approve or not approve. But now the rules are that you need to take into consideration climate change. The problem we have is we don't really know what it's going to be
in the future.
Thank you for the question.
¿Alguna otra pregunta aquí en sala? Adelante, doctor Manuel.
Brent, hi. The last comment you gave us,
Yes.
remember me the Houghton sentence. The past is the key
Yes.
of the present.
Yeah.
But I think that nowadays the present, the small present we know
Yeah.
is the key for the future, especially in hazards,
Yeah.
because we cannot modeling or we cannot predict.
Yeah.
It's very ambitious. Predict, estimate how the hazard will be in the near future without considering the climate change. But the point is, as anywhere in any place, how much data we have for estimate the near future climate change.
Yeah. No, that's a great, it's a huge problem because we can, the modelers, they can say, well, these are the trends. But when you start to say, like, what's it going to do in this one community? Like, what's it going to do? And they go, well, we don't really know, because we can say that the warming atmosphere will allow more water, but there's also areas in BC that are going to get drier, right? Because of the change in the circulation. So it's a very difficult question to answer, and politicians don't like that. They want an answer, and we can't give them we can give them a range.
Yeah, it was in the same topic, because you have to take an action. So which one of your modeling is you are going to choose?
Yeah.
The medium one or the worst one?
Yeah.
Because
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how the engineers are going to try to integrate that information, because they keep asking. They say, well, tell us what the yearly precipitation is going to be at this culvert site 50 years from now. And we the modelers, they just can't. They can't answer that question. They just can assume it's going to be worse. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. We have one question from social media. You can read it in the screen.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. The local authorities are certainly much more engaged with the issues surrounding hazards now. Certain communities before were very much engaged in that, but the issues we have is the most vulnerable communities are the smallest ones that don't have professional staff, and the worst of those are First Nations communities, and those are the ones that are usually at highest risk. So we're making at the center a concerted effort to try to reach out to First Nations communities and try to give them some expertise in this area. But you're right. I mean, there needs to be leadership by the government to, make those connections stronger between the researchers, the people working in the government ministries, the municipalities that are affected, and the professionals that are working in the area. And there's a certain strong social science aspect to this because people are very resistant to change and they want to rebuild on the floodplain even though it puts them at high risk. I hope I answered your question.
Yes. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta aquí en sala? Bien, tampoco tenemos más preguntas en redes sociales. Siendo así, queremos agradecer al Dr. Ward nos haya acompañado en esta emisión del Seminario CIGA Alexander von Humboldt y a quienes nos acompañaron aquí en el Aula Magna del CIGA para esta emisión híbrida. Esperamos poder recibirlos y saludarles muy pronto. Muchas gracias, Dr. Ward. Thank you very much and welcome to the CIGA.
Muchas gracias.
Hasta pronto.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.